first, so we are going to get out first. What has Rick been going through? Were you guys going through David? No? Okay. All right. We're going to, you guys did go through, wasn't Rick going through David at one point? Samuel. Okay, so we're actually in 2 Samuel in the teen class, so we're going to be kind of maybe going through some of the things that y'all have already gone through, but this was a little bit last notice for me, so we're just going to continue with what we were going through with the teens, and we will call it good on that. I don't know how Rick normally teaches. I'm a big questions person. If I ask a question, I like an answer. So if I ask a question and you know it, feel free to chime up and give your thoughts. We are in 2 Samuel, kind of at the end of verse 13, or at the end of chapter 13, around verse 21 is where we're at. I'll try not to ask too many questions since I'm on the mic, so that way the people can all hear. I'll have to make sure to repeat everything. So we've been going through 1 and 2 Samuel. We made it through 1 Samuel. We're now into 2 Samuel. We've been looking at the theme of these two books being the idea that God opposes the proud and he exalts the humble. We see it with Saul, with David. We see it throughout the first book, several instances of it. And as we get into 2 Samuel, we still see this idea of God opposes the proud and he exalts the humble. We see David's exalted as king. We see that once when Saul dies, the other kings that they try to put up in Saul's place, they are eventually brought down so that David can rise to succession. We even see really in chapters, let's see, is it 7, 8, and 9, we see a bunch of David's military victories. He's relying on God. He's trusting in God, and we see that victory after victory after victory after victory happens for the Israelite people because they're trusting in God. They're relying on God for these victories. And we just covered last week, even through chapter 10 we see that. And last week we covered David's big mess up, David and Bathsheba. And we kind of looked at, when we look in verse 1 of chapter 11, it says, in the springs when kings marched out to war, David sent Joab and his officers and all Israel. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rahab, but David remained in Jerusalem. And we kind of made note that this was possibly David, maybe his pride was starting to build. We've won. I'll take a break. I'll stay back this time. I know we're going to get the victory because so far they really haven't lost. And so maybe this was David's, a little bit of his pride kind of showing up. I'm going to relax. I'm going to send them out and everything will be fine. And then we see the whole instance with David and Bathsheba. David sees Bathsheba, inquires about her. They meet. He ends up realizing that he got her pregnant. He summons Uriah, has Uriah brought back. Uriah's too good. He's too noble. And ultimately, David sends Uriah back with his death sentence in his hand, and Uriah dies in battle. And God sends Nathan to tell David what he's done is wrong. What he's done is evil in the eyes of God. And so Nathan comes, tells David a parable, says, you're the man. And we see some of the consequences of this action in chapter 12, verse, I don't have it marked. I'm using a different Bible than what I normally do, and so I don't have some of the things marked. Let's see. Somewhere in chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 10, he says, this is Nathan's words to David concerning what's going to happen. He says, now therefore the sword will never leave your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Thus says the Lord, I'm going to bring disaster on you from your own family. And so we see a consequence besides David losing that son that he was going to have. We see that the sword's never going to depart from David. There's going to be evil rise up in his own house. And really that sets the tone all the way through about chapter 19. We see issues arise in David's house. The first one we see is with Amon and Tamar, which we're not going to go to in detail. But that's the first instance, and Amon and Tamar is an example of the sword rising up in his house. There's evil coming from his house in that situation, and then we see that that really just continues to build mostly through, I believe it's chapter 19, when David finally comes back into his kingdom. And so we're going to pick up in verse 21 of chapter 13. After the instance with Amon and Tamar, about 2 years separated from what happened at the beginning of chapter 13. So I'm going to read, I don't want to read all of it, but we're going to read some of it. We're going to start reading in verse 26. Absalom is trying to get vengeance on Amon, who was with Tamar. And so starting in verse 26, Absalom's trying to convince the king to let all of them go to Shear. And so he says, if not, Absalom said, please let my brother Amon go with us. He wants everyone to go so it doesn't look suspicious, but he goes, if you're not going to send everyone, at least send Amon, because really that's the only person he wants. And the king asked him, why should he go with you? But Absalom urged him, so he sent Amon and all of the king's sons. Now Absalom commanded his young men, watch Amon until he is in a good mood from the wine, and I order you to strike Amon and kill him. Don't be afraid. Am I not the one who is commanding you? Be strong and valiant. So Absalom's young men did to Amon just as Absalom had commanded, and all the rest of the king's sons got up and each fled on his mule. So Absalom is finding a way to get his vengeance. And so he isolates them. He tells his young men, it's interesting, the phrase used in verse 28, at the end of verse 28, what does that remind y'all of? Verse 28, the end of verse 28, that phrase at the end, what does that remind y'all of, or who does that make y'all think of? If we were to go back to the book of Deuteronomy and Judges, that's very similar to what Moses and God was telling David. No, be strong and courageous. Am I not the one with you? It seems very interesting. We already see the influence that Absalom has with his young men, or servants, or whatever the case it is. They are already eager to follow him. They are willing to follow him. And so Absalom strikes down Amon for what he did to his sister. And the vengeance has started. After this, Amon, I get them confused because they're both A's. Absalom ends up fleeing, and he hides out for 2 years. He goes to his grandfather. In verse 37, it says, but Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Amhudai, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. So he went to live with his grandfather. We read that back in chapter 3, verse 3, that's where his mom was from. And so he basically runs to some family to try to hide out, and he stays there for 3 years. So he waited 2 years until he was able to get his vengeance on Amon. And then after it, he realizes that David's probably going to be after him. So he runs and flees and hides out for 3 years. And finally, Joab, who seems to be a very close advisor to David, he's a military commander. What does Joab realize about David in chapter 14, verse 1? Yeah, he says, he realized his mind was on Absalom. He kept thinking of him because Absalom is one of his sons. He's still a son, so he mourns for Amon because of his death. But his son has been gone for 3 years. And there's that, his mind keeps going to him. The king's mind's fixated on, it's his son. Is he okay? I haven't heard anything. Is he doing well? And Joab realizes this. And so Joab goes, I got an idea. And so chapter 14 is Joab figuring out a way to get the king to understand that it's okay if he brings Absalom back, or trying to convince him to reconcile with Absalom. And so Joab goes and he finds a woman from Teoko, there in verse 4. And Joab basically tells her, make up a parable, and we're going to tell the king, and then we're going to use it to convince him that what he's doing is silly, essentially. And so the woman tells this parable. And I'm going to pick up reading in verse 4 of chapter 14. It says, when the woman of Tekoa came to the king, she fell face down on the ground and paid homage and said, help me, your majesty. What is the matter? The king asked her. Sadly, I am a widow. My husband died, she said. Your servants had 2 sons, and they were fighting in a field in the field with no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant and said, hand over the one who killed his brother, so that we may put him to death for the life of the brother he murdered. He will eliminate the heir that would extinguish my one remaining ember by not preserving my husband's name or prosperity on the earth. So this lady tells him that she's a widow, she has 2 sons, and they were fighting, and one ended up killing the other one. And justice, to be served, that son should die. He murdered his brother. They're calling that the other son be murdered because of his crime. And the widow's like, but if they do this, then who will take care of me? I will no longer have a son. My husband's name won't continue. It's a delicate situation. And so David thinks about it, and he goes, all right, go home. I'll issue command. No one's going to kill your son. And she goes, she pleads with him, make sure, do it in the name of the Lord. And he does so, by his word, by the name of the Lord, nothing will happen to that one son of yours. And then Joab comes in at the end and says, or he realizes based on how the woman's responding, he goes, did Joab send you? And she's like, yes, Joab sent me. And David brings in Joab, and David kind of sees what he's been doing. He understands, he's wanted his son back, but he's probably felt this burden of fatherhood versus being king. I mean, Absalom deserved to be put to death based on the old law. And David being king, he has the power to just say no. But what does that look like for the king? And I'm sure he struggled back and forth with that up until this point. Through this intervention, I guess, Joab sets up. And so David agrees, go bring back my son. Go bring back Absalom. And whenever he comes back, this was another verse I didn't mark. In verse 24, he says, however, the king added, he may return to his house, but he may not see my face. So Absalom returns to his house, but he did not see the king's face. We see that there is still some type of resentment that David feels towards Absalom. He wants to reconcile, but he really doesn't want to reconcile. He's still torn between, he's brought him back to his house. He's able to stay in his house, but he won't see my face. And he doesn't see David's face for another 2 years. So that 2 years, that I kind of forgive you, but not really. And I'm sure that festered with Absalom so much that Absalom finally decides, I want to see the king. And so in verse 28, it says, he's been there for 2 years. He has never seen the king. And then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab was unwilling to come to him, so he sent him again a second time, but he still would not come. Then Absalom said to his servant, see, Joab has a field right next to mine, and he has barley there. Go set it on fire. And so Absalom's servant set the field on fire. We see Absalom is very uncontrollable. He's very, I don't get what I want, I'll find a way to get it. And so whenever Joab doesn't show up to meet Absalom's request, Absalom decides, I'll get his attention somehow. I'll burn what he has. I'll just burn the field, and that'll get his attention. And sure enough, it says, then Joab came to Absalom's house and demanded, why did your servant set fire to my field? Got his attention. Absalom has successfully got his attention. And so he goes, I want to go to the king. You wouldn't answer me, so I did the next best thing. I caught your field on fire. I got your attention. You're welcome. Essentially, Absalom, his servants are right there with him. I mean, they are clearly very trustworthy companions. They're willing to kill Ammon for him. They're willing to set this field on fire of the commander of David's armies. Very influential guy. I wouldn't want to mess with him. I mean, he's probably a mighty man. And they set his field on fire. And Absalom basically says, take me to the king. I set your field on fire. I got your attention. Take me to the king. And so he does. And all that we're told is Absalom, in verse 33, Absalom bows down and pays homage, and the king kisses him. That's all we have. There's no dialogue of how it went, but for them, they reconciled. At this point, 5 years, they've reconciled the best that they know how. Because I'm sure David's still struggling with this. He's still dealing with the fact that his son killed his other son. He doesn't know how to deal with it. But all of this half reconciliation and half forgiveness really builds, I think, a lot in Absalom that we don't get to read about, that we don't hear about. And in chapter 15, we see things start to go downhill real quick for David. What's y'all's heading in chapter 15? Absalom's conspiracy. Absalom is going to try to find a way to get into the throne. Whether he thinks because of David's poor judgment in regarding what he did with Ammon, or the fact that he didn't fully forgive him and the whole reconcile thing, he thinks he's a bad king. Absalom is going to come up with a way to get into the throne. And so Absalom starts setting up the stage. He does this surprisingly well, and it really shows his intelligence, because when you read through it, he took his time and he did this really well to make sure that it wouldn't fail, which is impressive. So I'm going to start reading in chapter 15, verse 2. And this is how he starts setting the stage for this conspiracy and this revolt. He goes, Absalom, he would go up early and stand beside the road leading into the city gates, where everyone had a grievance to bring before the king for settlement. Absalom called to him and asked him, what city are you from? He replied, your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel. Absalom said to him, look, your claims are good and right, but the king doesn't have anyone to listen to you. He added, if only someone would appoint me judge of the land, then anyone who would have a grievance or dispute could come to me, and I would make sure he received justice. When the person approached and paid homage to him, Absalom reached out, took hold of him and kissed him. And Absalom did this to all the Israelites who came to the king for a settlement. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And when 4 years had passed, Absalom said to the king, so for 4 years, Absalom has been setting the stage. He's been convincing the people. He's been getting the people on his side. We see that this was the same thing that kind of happened with David and getting David into his leadership. We see the people started praising David. Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands, and people's hearts were won over to David. And Absalom understands that if he wants to become king, he's got to win the hearts. And so Absalom sets the stage. He starts stealing the hearts of the people for 4 years, and then he asks to go to Hebron. And the king says, go in peace. And the king sent him away to Hebron. David was presented as king in Hebron. Back in the early part of 2 Samuel, when he becomes king, he's crowned in Hebron. And so Absalom understands, I got to make this look legit. I got to make this look like it's really happening. So I'm going to go to Hebron, same place where David was put on the crown. and we're gonna make this look right. And so he goes to Hebron, and then Absalom sent messengers throughout the tribe of Israel with this message: when you hear the sounds of the ram horns, you are to say, Absalom has become king in Hebron. And so he's setting the stage. 200 men from Jerusalem went with Absalom. They had been invited, and they were going innocently, for they did not know the whole situation. Absalom has done his homework. He has been very vigilant. He has convinced 200 people to go with him to make it look legit. He's trying his best to make this look official. And they did the offering and sacrifice, and it was informed to David that Absalom had won the hearts, and it was at that moment David realizes, oh no. He let this, I don't know, surely, I want to think that there is no way Absalom could keep this a secret for 4 years. I'm sure there had to be some whispers, there had to be some rumors. I mean, a conspiracy like this, involving 200 people, winning the hearts of the people, surely there were whispers of this, and maybe David didn't do anything. It doesn't tell us, that's reading into it, but surely there had to be at least a whisper or something. And ultimately, whenever they come to inform David that Absalom has won the hearts of the men of Israel, David realizes the situation, and they flee. They get going. They leave. They flee the castle, and when we look back up in verse 12, it's one of David's advisors, Athophilia, the Galmornite from the city of Gio. So the conspiracy grew strong in the people. So one of David's own inner council was helping Absalom with the conspiracy, which seems a little bit odd. But if we were to jump around a little bit and look at some different passages, we come out to find that advisor of David was actually Bathsheba's grandfather. And so it kind of makes sense on why he was so willing to help Absalom. It's almost his way of getting vengeance on David for what he did with Bathsheba, his granddaughter. And so he joins and helps Absalom in the conspiracy, making sure everything goes smoothly there in Jerusalem. And so David flees. It is the slow downfall. We see Absalom is rising, David is fleeing, but even in the midst of this, we can still see some of David's character. When we look at verses 19 through 23, it's kind of a weird thought that's kind of almost thrown in here. It almost seems out of place. Starting in verse 19, it says, "The king said to Etha of Gath, 'Why are you also going with us? Go back and stay with the new king, since you are both foreigners and exiles from your homeland. Besides, you only arrived yesterday. Should I make you wander around with us today while I go wherever I can? Go back and take your brother with you. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness.' But in response, Ithiah vowed to the king, 'As the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king is, whether it means life or death, your servant will be there.' 'March on,' David replied to Ilith. So Ilith and Gath marched past with all the men and departed, and dependents who were with him." It's kind of a weird chunk. They're trying to flee, and then we have this short remark of David telling a few people, y'all don't need to go with us. Y'all need to stay. You're foreigners. You don't know this place. You guys just stay. And we see that they're wanting to stay regardless of the situation. They barely know David. They've been there for a day. They arrived yesterday. And it kind of goes to show the difference between David's leadership and Absalom's leadership. When we look at Absalom, he convinced 200 people to come with him without telling them the whole story. They have been invited, and they were going innocently. They didn't know the whole story. And here, David is laying it out before this lady and her brother, saying, "Y'all need to stay. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know how this is going to end." But we still see the leadership of David, that pull he has, that he had all the way back in 1 Samuel. People are drawn to him. He's a good leader. We see his character. Despite some of his flaws, he's still an excellent leader, and we kind of see that people are still willing to follow him, and they want to follow him. Is there any questions or comments concerns up to this point? It doesn't seem like many, but it's at least enough to convince everyone that, hey, maybe this is legit. He's already got a small following. We'll follow along. It only takes, you get that one follower, get one person to do it, and everyone kind of goes, okay. Absalom went down and got 200 people to be his followers, and everyone went, oh, wow. All right, we'll just follow right along with these 200. And it happens pretty quick, and David has the foresight to know what's coming, and he gets out of there before anything happens. It's also interesting when we look at verses 25 and kind of following, some people tried to bring the ark. The king instructed Zodek, return the ark of God to the city. I don't know where the ark was compared to where David's house was, because it was still in the tabernacle up until this point. But clearly, some of the priests had already ran over to the tabernacle, picked up the ark, and were hoofing it with David. And David's like, hold up, back up, go take the ark back. We don't need it, it's going to stay. And his response is in verse 25, return the ark of God to the city. If I find favor with God, he will bring me back and allow me to see both it and its dwelling place. It's possible Zodek was thinking that they needed the ark, maybe to help them, almost like a good luck charm, so to speak. And David realizes that's not the case. If he's going to find favor with God, God's going to bring him back. This is a lesson that he learned probably through Saul. If we were to go all the way back to 1 Samuel chapter 4, we see the Israelites did this exact same thing. They went out to fight the Philistines, and they brought the ark. And they were trusting that the ark would give them the victory, and ultimately God gave them over into the Philistines' hands. The ark was captured. David has learned from those past mistakes, and he goes, it's not the ark, it's not the thing. He goes, if God wants me back, he's going to bring me back. And I'll try to find favor in his eyes so that I get to come back and I get to see his dwelling place. He's, even in this moment of chaos that's going on, David is still humbling himself before God. He's still trusting in God that God's going to see it through because of the promises that were made back in chapter, it's way back here, chapter 9? Nope, just kidding. Chapter 7, all the way back in chapter 7, that David's house is going to be established forever. The Davidic line is going to be continued forever. He has these confident expectations of God's promises. He's going to make sure that it happens, and he's still trusting God as they flee and as they run off into the wilderness. And so the first place they go, or as they're starting this journey, we see that we are introduced to Ziba, a servant of, I don't even really want to try to say that name, the 16, chapter 1. It's a really long name that I will butcher. But this is one of Saul's sons, one of Jonathan's sons, so Saul's grandson. And David has shown him kindness, and so this is one of his servants that we're introduced to back in chapter... Man, I didn't realize how changing the Bible would affect me this much. Back in chapter 9, we're introduced, and we see how David shows them kindness, and he is here to help them. And it's interesting, we kind of get two sides of the story here. We get one half now, and we get the other half. If I didn't write it down, I'll be upset. We get the other half in chapter 19, just a few chapters later. So Ziba basically says, the king asks him, where's your master? Where's your master? And he goes, well, he didn't come. He stayed in the city. He wanted to help the other king, basically saying that, he's left you. He's betrayed you. He's going to serve the other king now and not you. He's hoping that, maybe that Absalom will restore him to be king and Saul's lineage will continue. And so David's like, well, how dare he do this? And so the king says to him in verse 4, everything that I gave to your master is yours. It's all yours. Take it. It's yours now, because he would do such a thing as, after the kindness I showed him, to leave me in my time of need, because he thinks that Saul's lineage is going to be put back on the throne. But in chapter 19, we kind of get the other side of that coin, where, I have to say his name. What? Mephibosheth. Man, it is these names. Saul's grandson. We'll call him Saul's grandson for the sake of saying his name. Saul's grandson basically says, that's not the case. He told you a lie. I thought I could be more of help to you and the people that you left there if I stayed. And David's like, oh, well, I already gave everything to your servant, so y'all just have it now. And it's kind of interesting to see that we kind of see how things get chaotic. David, his almost lack of judgment. It was an immediate reaction. We kind of see he has that reaction in 1 Samuel with Nabal. He gets a response and he goes, boom, I'm going to act. And it's kind of that same situation here. He hears one side of the story and he immediately reacts without getting the full context of what's going on. Any questions or comments or thoughts? How much time we got? Okay, we're doing good. All right. As we continue making our way through chapter 16, they're on the run, they're fleeing, and I want us to pick up reading in verse 7. Verse 7 of chapter 16. Shimei said, as he cursed, get out, the man of bloodshed, you wicked man, talking about David. They were throwing stones at David and his men as they were on their way out. He says, the Lord has paid you back for all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have become king, and the Lord has handed the kingdom over to your son Absalom. Look, you are in trouble because you are a man of bloodshed. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and remove his head. And the king replied, son of Zeruiah, do we agree on anything? He curses me this way because the Lord told him, curse David. Therefore, who can say, why did you do that? And David said to Abishai and all his servants, look, my own son, my own flesh and blood, intends to take my life. How much more now this Benjaminite? Leave him alone and let him curse me. The Lord has told him to do so. Perhaps the Lord will see my affliction and restore my goodness to me instead of Shimei's curse today. So we see that David is being cursed. People are calling him out saying, you're a man of bloodshed. You've taken Saul's throne by force. You deserve what's coming to you. And David's response is different than what many of us may have in a situation like this. David's like, don't cut off his head. Don't behead him. The Lord told him that this is what he was to say. And I'm sure David had some type of reminder of what's going on. During this time, especially in the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, there's a theology of retribution. Essentially saying that, if you're good, if you're prosperous, if you're wealthy, if you're healthy, then you are doing good and God is blessing you. But if you're poor, if you're lame, if you're sick, if you're crippled, well, you must have done something wrong. You must be doing something against God's will. We see with Job. Job and all his friends are like, curse God and die. You clearly messed up. And Job's like, but I haven't done anything. I haven't done anything. They're like, clearly you have, because you had everything and now you had nothing. You've clearly messed up. Repent. We even see it with his apostles when they ask who sinned first, this man or his parents, that he was born lame. It's that theology of bad things happen because you're disobeying God. And so that may be a part of what David was thinking. Yes, I've God's punishing me. I've messed up. I've clearly done something wrong. But also, when we go back to chapter 12, verses 10 through 11, where he says, the sword is going to be against your house. Evil will rise up from your own house. Maybe that was ringing in David's head as this individual is shouting curses at them. Maybe it's bouncing around. He's like, yeah, this was supposed to happen. God had this plan. The sword is in my house. And that was bouncing around in his head, knowing that it's a consequence of what happened, a consequence of what resulted with what happened with Bathsheba. And it was just bouncing around in his head that whole time. And so we see in verses 15 through really 23, David, we didn't read it, but David, he leaves some men in chapter 15 to be advisors to the king. They were his advisors in verse 32 of chapter 15. They were his advisors, and David is like, actually, you guys need to stay. Y'all stay. Y'all tell me, basically get word to me somehow what's going on. Try to influence him. Try, say that you served me, his father, and that you're going to serve him just as well as you served me. But the whole time, report to me. Tell me what's going on. Tell me what's happening. And so we see in verses 15 through 23, we see the council is trying to give Absalom some decision. Absalom has finally made it to the kingdom. He's in David's house, realizes David has fled. And so, let's see, what's his name? In verse 21, Ahithophel, which was Bathsheba's grandfather that we saw mentioned earlier, that kind of turned on David, starts trying to give him some counsel. And what happens in the following is exactly what God says is going to happen in chapter 12, verse 11, that his wives will be given to someone else, and that what he did in secret is going to be done before everyone. And that's kind of fulfilling what Nathan said was going to happen to David. So we see that the sword, we see evil rise up in his own house. The incident with Ammon and Tamar, we see the sword isn't leaving his house. You have Absalom revolting. You have Absalom causing all kinds of trouble. And we see that what David did in secret is being done in the eyes of the whole kingdom at the end of chapter 16. Is there any questions or comments or anything along those lines? Wow, it's like just if y'all were, it's like teen class, everyone's silent. All right, so we make our way into chapter 17, and this is where we kind of start having the council back and forth, trying. You have basically two sides of the council. You have the people working for David are trying to convince him of one thing, and you have Bathsheba's grandfather trying to convince him of another thing, because really he wants some type of vengeance. Let's get rid of David because he's on Absalom's side. And so he tells them, let's choose 20,000 men, and we will set in pursuit of David tonight, and I will attack him while he is weary and discouraged, throw him into a panic, and all the people with him will scatter. I will strike down only the king. So he wants, this advisor, one that's been advising to David, is now taking the role of, I want to go strike down David. He's clearly holding on to some vengeance, some anger that he's dealing with. And he wants to bring the people back to him. He wants to wipe out David. But we see David's counsel, the people that he put there are working for him. And so Hushai, which is one of David's advisors that he left, came to Absalom, and Absalom told him, Ahithophel is offering this proposal. Should we carry out this proposal? If not, well, what do you say? So one says, go kill the king. We go right now. We get him while he's in a panic, and I'll kill the king, and we'll resolve this mess. And so he goes, okay, well, let's hear what someone else has to say. And so he replies, this advice from him is given this time is not good. This is not good advice. And he continues in verse 8, you know your father and his men. They are warriors and are desperate like wild bears robbed of their cubs. Your father is an experienced soldier who wouldn't spend the night with his people. He's probably already hiding in one of the caves or some other place. If some of our troops fall first, someone is sure to hear and say, 'There's been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.' Then even a brave man with the heart of a lion will lose heart, because all Israel knows that your father is a valiant man. With him are warriors. Instead, I advise all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sands of the sea, be gathered to you, and that you personally go into battle. Then we will attack David, whether we find him, and we will descend on him like dew on the ground. Not even one will be left, neither he nor any that are with him. If he retreats to some city, all Israel will bring roads to that city, and we will drag his stones into the valley until not even one pebble can be found there. Since the Lord has decreed that Anthopel's good advice be undermined in order to bring about Absalom's ruin. Absalom and all his men of Israel said, the advice of Hishah the Architite is better than Aphilo's advice. So we see that David's plan worked. David wanted to leave someone there to influence the king. And honestly, the first advice was probably the better advice. It probably would have ended it pretty quick. We see David as he's marching through the Garden of Olives. They're sackcloth and ash. They're mourning. They're weeping. They're sorrowful. They're just focused on getting out far enough away. But the Lord is still with David. We see starting in 2 Samuel, I think it's chapter 18 or 17 and 18. We see this almost a secondary theme show up, where despite human evil, God's plan is going to prevail. And we see that God's plans for David to become a king, and we see how God helps that plan avail despite Saul's evil. And even here, we still see it. God is working with David. He allows the first advice to be undermined. We see that David allows Absalom to pick the second advice because God's working with David. He's going to try to get David back to the throne, back to being king, because that's who he picked. That is who his king is for Israel, not Absalom. And so the conspiracy to try to get Absalom to go in and fight personally to get rid of him, it seems to be working. It seems everything's moving according to God's plan. Any questions or comments thus far? No? Okay. I see some head shakes now. All right. So, verse 15. We see that after the advice is given, we see that word has to get to David. All right, here's what's going on at the kingdom. Here's what's happening. Here's how I advised him. And so they send someone quickly to David. In verse 16, don't spend the night in the wilderness, but for sure cross over the Jordan, or the king and all his people with him will be devoured. Jonathan and Adonai were staying in Rogate, where the servant girl would come to pass along the information to them. They in turn would go to inform the king, because they dared not be seen entering the city. However, a young man did see them and informed Absalom, so the two left quickly and came to the house of a man in Bartham, and he had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. So we see a big game of cat and mouse. If this was a movie, I think it would be a very interesting movie scene. We see that they're setting up plans, they're setting up ways to get communication from one another without being seen. They get caught, they go hide in this dude's well. They're trying to help David out. They're trying to stay under the radar. And whenever Absalom finds out, they tell him, they inform him. They climbed out of the well and they informed the king. They told him, get up immediately for the river, for Anthopel has given this advice against you. So David and all his people went with him, and they crossed the Jordan by daybreak. There was not one of them who had crossed the Jordan. And when Anthopel realized that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown, and he set his house in order and hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. He wanted to be influential. Maybe David didn't care a lot for his advice when he was advising him, but he was hoping that he would get his chance for vengeance. He wanted to get back at David. And whenever his advice was turned down and that chance was gone, he takes matters into his own hands. But once when David crosses that Jordan, he's kind of in a safe place. He kind of leaves the territory of Israel. He's kind of in the land of the Moabites and the Edomites, and the other side of the Jordan, a little bit safer, a little bit outside of the king's reach. And so for a time, they're safe. But eventually, they're going to find him. Any questions, comments, concerns? Look at that. That's a good head nod right there. No questions. All right. So as we continue, we're going to go make our way into chapter 18, where Absalom is ultimately defeated. So starting, let's see, we started early. We're almost there. So starting in chapter 18, we're going to try to make it through about the first 8 verses right before his death, or hopefully through his death, and we'll kind of end it there since we started a little bit early. It says, David renewed his troops and appointed commanders of thousands and hundreds over them, and he set out the troops, a third under Joab, a third under Joab's brother, Asher, the son of Zurich, which that's the dude that wanted to behead that other person a few chapters back, and a third under Ithiah of Gath, which is one of the individuals that begged to come with David after they were getting ready to flee. So he's clearly been of great use to David, and he sets him over one of the garrisons. And he goes, they must march out. The people pleaded, if we had to flee, they would not pay us any attention to us. Even if half of us die, they will not pay attention to us, because you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it is better if you support us from the city. I will do whatever you think is best, the king replied to them. So he stood beside the gate while all the troops marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king commanded Joab, Asher, and Ithiah, treat the young men, Absalom, gently for my sake. And all the people heard the king's orders, and all the commanders about Absalom. And David's forces marched into the field to engage Israel in battle, which took place in the forest of Ephraim. Israel's army was defeated by David's soldiers, and that the slaughter there was vast that day. 20,000 dead, and the battle sparred over the entire area. So they find them, they start engaging in this battle, but David still longs for his son. We see that even this is the same type of mentality David had with King Saul. I'm not going to strike Saul down. Saul basically became his father-in-law first, but he also became like a father. He lived in the castle. He lived under Saul. Jonathan was his best friend. They were close, and the whole time David is like, I'm not going to strike Saul. We're not going to deal with Saul. And even here with his own son, we still see that happening. We still see David's character of trying go easy on Absalom. Like don't just go out and kill him. Be gentle with him. Maybe we can resolve this in a different way. And we see that it kind of happens. It says, as Absalom was riding, happened to meet David's soldiers, his mule went out under the tangled branches of the large oak. Absalom's head was caught fast in the tree, and the mule under him kept going, and he was suspended in midair. And one of the men saw him and informed him, Joab, and he said, I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. And if we were to go back and read previous chapters, it tells that Absalom was very handsome and that he had long hair, and that he would grow out his hair all year, and at the end of the year he would cut it, kind of restart it. It weighed like 20 shekels. It was a lot of hair. And it's interesting, that's ultimately what gets him. His hair gets caught up in the trees, and he's just dangling there. And someone goes and says, Joab, I think I saw him hanging in that oak tree over there. And so, you just saw him, Joab explains. Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? And I would have given you 10,000 pieces of silver and a belt. And the man replied, even if I had the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver in my hands, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For we heard the king's command. You Ashla and Ithiah, protect the young man Absalom for me. If I jeopardize my own life and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have abandoned me. And Joab said, and I'm not going to waste time with you. Then he took 3 spears in his hand, and he thrust them into Absalom's chest while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 young men who were with Joab, armor bearers, surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. And so we see that this battle, it was great, but it was also like kind of anticlimactic. He gets caught in a tree, and he kind of just sits there during his death. But Joab, we kind of see Joab's hatred. Joab stuck his neck out for Absalom. Joab went to the king to plead with the king, you should bring him back. It's causing you so much grief. Bring him back. Reconcile with your son. And what does Joab get in return? He gets Absalom winning over the people's hearts, running David out, basically mistreating everything that David owns, and now he's told to spare him. Joab is not going to happen. He's, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. No, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Joab is not going to let it happen again. And Joab takes matters into his own hands, and he blows the ram's horn, and the troops broke off in pursuit of Israel because Joab restrained them. Once when Absalom was dead, the battle was over. Their leader is dead. They're going to revert back. Eventually, David is going to make his way back to restore the throne. Is there any questions or comments up to this point? It's always interesting reading the Old Testament. We get a lot of different wording, and things were very different than they are in today's, but we still see some of the same things that we deal with. We see the vengeance. We see the anger that these people had. People sticking their necks out for people, and those people betraying them and them turning their back on them. But we still see that throughout it, David is still remaining humble. God exalts the proud, and God exalts the humble and opposes the proud. There we go. And we still see that happening even now through all these battles. David is he's still trusting in God. He's still relying on God. And those who are prideful, those who build themselves up, are brought to ruin. We see Absalom's brought low, even though he raised himself up through his own pride and his own work. If there's no questions or comments, we are dismissed. You're welcome.